Hello, everyone. In this video, the first of three on Julio Cortázar's House Taken Over, we're going to be taking a look at several sample essay sections. In other words, we're going to take some of the themes that we discussed in the context of our synchronous lecture and asynchronously go over a sample essay along with guidelines for the composition of an essay. I'm going to talk to you about some of the necessary components of an introduction in one video, a body paragraph in the next video, and then a conclusion in the third video, and also discuss a few of the pitfalls that you might encounter as you're developing an essay. So, the essay structure that I recommend, at least with respect to an introduction, is the funnel method, where you start out in your introduction with the most broad or general commentary, and then begin to narrow your focus as you develop your argument and develop your ideas all the way to the most specific, clear, and direct statement in your essay, the thesis statement. In this handout that has also been posted on Omnivox for you to review, I begin by laying out this funnel method. The introduction is broken down into four key elements. Element 0 is a creative opening or a hook. You don't necessarily have to have one of those. Element 1 is an identification and summary of the literary text in only a few sentences. Element 2 is a transition to the thesis, where you connect the summary to the thesis in some logical way. And then element 3 is the thesis statement and supporting arguments. Now, these supporting arguments may or may not be included. Some people or some professors prefer you to include clear, specific supporting arguments. Some ask you to include a guiding statement. There are many different ways to develop this section, and we'll go over several of those approaches to the thesis statement as we go on in this video. First, element 0, the creative opening or hook. The hook is not strictly necessary. You don't need to include one. It is better not to have a hook, some kind of catchy introductory statement, than to have one that is poorly constructed. The hook introduces the general topic of the essay in a novel fashion, either with a properly cited quotation, some kind of fact or statement about the broader sphere of literature that you're dealing with. It's something to draw your reader in or to capture your reader's interest. But it has to be clearly connected, in a moment, to the text that you're dealing with. That connection transitions into element 1. And it's listed as element 1 because it's the first necessary element, as opposed to element 0, the creative opening or hook. Element 1 is an identification and summary of the literary text, or an alternative, an identification of the specific issue that you're going to address. And we'll look at these two possible kinds of elements for the next section of your introduction, the next 2 to 3 sentences. Briefly, you want to summarize or introduce the text, preparing the readers for your thesis by mentioning relevant details. In this section, state the work's title and, if known, the author. So, if you were writing an essay about Julio Cortázar's House Taken Over, you would give me Julio Cortázar and House Taken Over somewhere in that brief summary. The purpose of the summary is to establish certain key facts about the story that you are going to use or mention in your thesis statement or your guiding statement. You want to give the reader just enough of a brief overview about how this story connects either to the main idea or subject that you identified in your hook, and or the ideas that you're going to be developing in the next sections of your introduction, and thus, in turn, the rest of your essay as a whole. The alternate element 1, the alternate version of the next couple of sentences in your introduction, are brief or consists of a brief contextualization of your essay so that your reader knows what you're going to talk about. So introduce the subject or the issue that you're going to be arguing about, basically. In this section, and throughout the entire essay, it is highly important that you avoid generalizations. You don't want to say, well, in the 1920s, women were oppressed. Now, that may be true, but the specific nature of that oppression or the way in which women were oppressed in different areas and at different times during the 1920s or at any other historical period, that's something that requires substantiation through an appeal to a specific source. You can't just speak in this broad brush terms as if the situation for women was the same everywhere at a particular time. Element 2 is a transition to the thesis. This transition should consist of 1 or 2 sentences wherein you tie the ideas that you've mentioned in the summary into the thesis statement. So you're moving from these ideas that you've been discussing and showing how they're relevant or how they help to convey an argument in your thesis. That might sound abstract, but we're going to talk about it in specific detail when we look at the sample introduction at the end of this video. Element 3 is a thesis statement and supporting arguments. This section of the introduction should be 1 to 2 sentences. The thesis statement is both a direct answer to the essay question and the assertion that your essay will prove. So it is what you are going to argue. Now, the thesis statement is the most important part of your introduction. If you have a strong thesis, the rest of the essay is probably going to be on the right track, even if your introduction doesn't quite fit the bill. It doesn't quite conform to this format or another legitimate structure, because you'll still have a core insight, an argument that makes sense and that can carry the weight of a full essay. The key elements of a thesis statement are these. First, it should be arguable. A thesis statement can't be a question. And it also can't be a statement such as, well, this essay is going to investigate the issue of, let's say, tradition in Julio Cortázar's House Taken Over. That's just a statement of what the essay is going to be about. It's more like telling me this essay is going to be about tradition. It doesn't give me a clear, specific argument. The argument then must be clear and specific. It's not general, and the point that's being made doesn't provoke any questions about the intended argument or its scope. You have to provide me with enough information so that I don't have any questions about what the argument means or what you're going to be trying to prove. It has to be direct, though. So balancing clear and specific is this idea of directness. Make sure you're conveying your ideas precisely, but with as few words, as directly as possible. And lastly, a subjective criterion, it should be interesting. Can you engage your reader? Can you make your reader interested in what you're going to be arguing in that thesis statement? Now, depending on your professor, depending on the structure that you're most comfortable with, your thesis may state 2 or 3 supporting arguments, points, or literary devices. The major reasons why your thesis is valid. If you include those either in the thesis statement or the guiding statement, you should make sure that they are specific and they appear in the order that they'll appear in the essay. So your first point corresponds with your first paragraph, the second point with your second paragraph, the third with your third paragraph. I would actually encourage you to avoid using a guiding statement or these sort of list of literary devices. It can be done, but it doesn't necessarily need to be done. What I'd like you to do is to take a look at the 3 sample thesis statements that appear at the end of this page. Consider them based on the criteria above. Do these make for effective thesis statements? If they do, why? If they don't, why not? So, tradition shapes people's lives. Is it arguable, clear and specific, direct, and interesting? The author uses characterization, imagery, and symbolism to explore the impact of traditions. Arguable, clear and specific, direct, interesting. And according to the author, it's imperative to live according to the dictates of tradition. Pause the video, think about that for a minute, and then come back. Okay, so tradition shapes people's lives. First of all, one thing that you probably have noticed is that it doesn't include the author's name or the title of the story, which usually should be included in a thesis. It's not always strictly necessary, but it's a good rule of thumb to follow. Tradition shapes people's lives. Well, it's clear in the sense that I know what you're saying, but it's not specific. How does it shape people's lives? And if you're just saying, well, tradition shapes people's lives, it's not really arguable. That's inarguably true. It's a statement of fact, not a thesis. It's not an argument. If your argument is that this story, Julio Cortázar's House Taken Over, is all about the ways in which tradition shapes people's lives negatively, okay, all right, you're on to something. Then you could push it even further to say, well, people have to throw off the shackles of tradition, according to this story, in order to escape from the destructive impacts of illegitimate traditions. Now, that's clear, specific, arguable, and direct. We may not agree with it, or we may agree with it, but the point is that it is not simply a statement of fact. The author uses characterization, imagery, and symbolism to explore the impact of traditions. Well, you have your list of devices, that can work. But to explore the impact of tradition, that means simply that the story is talking about tradition. There's no specific argument there. So again, the issue of specificity. What is this text explicitly saying? What is being argued here or put forth is not addressed. And then lastly, according to the author, it's imperative to live according to the dictates of tradition. You know what? If you throw in a title of the story and the name of the author, that's a pretty good thesis. I think it could be expanded to be more specific. Right? It's imperative to live according to the dictates of tradition. Why? what happens because people live according to the dictates of tradition? Do they live happier and more fulfilling lives? Then you should say that. Make sure that your thesis is specific. So what you have here is the best of the thesis statements offered, but it is also one that requires improvement. It requires amelioration through expansion by way of the inclusion of more significant details and an answer to the why question. It's one thing to say, well, people should live according to tradition, according to the story, but why? What happens to people if they don't? What happens to people if they do? Now, the next section of this paper has an introduction, a sample introduction based on Julia Cortázar's House Taken Over. And I run through the various different elements of the introduction. Cultural tradition provides a semi-stable groundwork of thought and action, offering a metaphysical basis for life that guides and shapes a person from infancy. Even if she chooses to rebel against cultural mores, the nature of that revolt remains confined to certain predetermined or prescribed patterns that are prescribed by ideas against which she sets herself. Nonetheless, most generations find themselves in such a position. So this is just establishing the issue of tradition and how people relate to tradition. They're shaped by tradition. Even if you try to escape from tradition and fight against it, what you do to fight that tradition, to say, that is not mine, so I'm going to do something opposite to it, is still shaped by that tradition, because you're saying this, what exists, is not something to which I want to conform, so I'm going to conform to the exact opposite. I'm going to reject it. The only thing that can allow us to escape those traditions is by, well, forgetting them. Not acting against them or acting in accord with them, but by allowing them to die away into the mists of history. So, a kind of introduction to the general topic of tradition. Doesn't deal with a story yet. It just deals with the major subject that this essay is going to start talking about in relation to House Taken Over. Now, I begin to introduce the author and the story in element 1. Writing in a time of great political upheaval during the 1943 coup d'etat in his native Argentina, Julio Cortázar explores the evolving response to and rejection of tradition in his short story, House Taken Over. It describes the slow decline of a bourgeois family defined by its quasi-incestuous seclusion and self-absorption, and its wealth, accumulated through the exploitation of distant landholdings and farms. An undefined and disembodied force gradually displaces the last surviving members of this family, an aging and never married brother and sister, from their ancestral home. So, I've given a brief summary, and I've talked about that summary. I've focused the summary on the issues of tradition and inheritance. I've carried through my subject that I identified, tradition, into the summary of the story. Then, element 2, I start to transition to the thesis. Although the tale provides no description for or explanation of them, their kinship with the home itself, the fact that they appear to be an evidently natural element within it, suggests that they are the accumulated force of history, the traditions left behind by past generations. So I'm arguing in this essay, I'm going to claim that they symbolize tradition. Element 3, the thesis statement itself. Now that I have this transition, I've moved from, well, now that I have this transition, not tradition, now that I have this transition, I move from the summary to the thesis statement connecting them to tradition. Cortázar's tale then suggests that maintaining tradition is ultimately self-defeating, as it consumes the very people who attempt to defend it, confining them to stagnation and ultimately robbing them of the possibility of living unique and vibrant lives. Now, that thesis is a bit of a mouthful. It works, it's great, there's a lot of meat there for you to develop a full essay. But if you were writing an essay of your own, you could leave it at probably this. Cortázar's tale then suggests that maintaining traditions is ultimately self-defeating. That would be an acceptable thesis, but I would still need, or I would still want you to take it one step further by including a reason why. Why do people have to, or why do people who maintain traditions ultimately defeat themselves? Well, it consumes the very people who attempt to defend it, or because it confines the people who attempt to defend it to stagnation. That would be fine. You could render this thesis a little bit more concise while still preserving the core insight or the core argument, including that because or why statement. I have here now a list of incomplete thesis statements. You can review these to see how possible alterations to this thesis statement at the end of the introduction would go awry. I have a list of reasons why these thesis statements are not appropriate. So as you're thinking about your thesis statements and your introductions, try to use this as a bit of a guide. In the next video, we're going to take a look at the same kinds of guidelines for a body paragraph.